The cry that echoed through Ezekiel Hawthorne's mountain cabin should have been a moment of pure joy, but when the midwife placed the dark-skinned infant in his trembling hands, his weathered face went pale as winter frost. His wife Martha's exhausted eyes met his with terror as he whispered the words that changed everything. "Just like my grandfather warned me." The midwife's weathered hands worked with practiced efficiency as Martha lay trembling on the bed, her voice barely above a whisper, as she pleaded with her husband to explain what he meant about his grandfather's warning. Ezekiel stood frozen for a moment longer, staring at the child whose skin was several shades darker than either parent could account for, before he moved with sudden purpose toward the stone fireplace that had warmed their cabin through 3 harsh mountain winters. His fingers found the loose stone he had discovered years ago but never disturbed, prying it free to reveal a cavity that held secrets he had hoped would never matter. The leather journal that emerged was worn smooth by decades of handling, its pages yellowed and brittle as autumn leaves, and as he opened it to the marked page, his grandfather Samuel had insisted he read on his wedding day. The words seemed to pulse with their own terrible life. Martha struggled to sit up despite the midwife's protests, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate need to understand why her husband looked as though he had seen a ghost, while the baby in the midwife's arms remained eerily quiet, as if waiting for the truth to be spoken. The story that spilled from Ezekiel's lips came in halting fragments as he read from the journal, telling of how his grandfather, Samuel Hawthorne, had been found nearly dead in the winter of 1821 by a Cherokee medicine woman named Silent Crow, who had used herbs and rituals that the local preacher would have called witchcraft to pull him back from death's door. But salvation had come with a price that Samuel had not understood until the woman spoke her prophecy in broken English, warning that the debt of a life saved would be repaid in the 3rd generation through a child who would bridge 2 worlds and carry marks that would make men question what they thought they knew about blood and belonging. The lantern light flickered as if responding to the words, casting wild shadows across the cabin walls, while outside the October wind howled through the pines with a sound like distant voices, and Martha felt her world tilting on its axis as she looked between her husband and the dark-skinned infant who was supposedly theirs. Ezekiel's voice grew stronger as he continued reading, describing how his grandfather had dismissed the prophecy as the ravings of a dying culture until his own son, Ezekiel's father, had been born with a birthmark shaped like a crow in flight, and how that man had died young after warning Ezekiel to watch for signs in his own children. The midwife crossed herself and muttered prayers under her breath, but she did not flee as Ezekiel had feared, instead moving closer to examine the child with new eyes, searching for something beyond the unexpected colouring that had shocked them all into this moment of terrible revelation and impossible understanding. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Ezekiel turned the brittle pages with trembling fingers, finding the passage his grandfather had marked with dried flowers that crumbled at his touch, and his voice grew thick with emotion as he read Silent Crow's exact words that Samuel had recorded in shaking script the day after his rescue. The Cherokee woman had spoken of debts that transcended simple human understanding, of how saving a life created bonds that wove through bloodlines like roots through soil, and how the child born 3 generations hence would arrive bearing the physical manifestation of this spiritual debt, appearing as neither fully white nor fully native, but something entirely new that would confuse and frighten those who saw only with their eyes and not their souls. Martha pulled the infant closer to her chest, her initial shock transforming into fierce maternal protection as she began to understand that this child was not evidence of betrayal but rather the fulfillment of something ancient and beyond their control, and she found herself studying the baby's features with new eyes, seeing not wrongness, but a strange beauty in the way the child seemed to embody multiple histories in one small form. The journal revealed more disturbing details as Ezekiel continued reading, describing how Silent Crow had warned Samuel that the child would be born during a time of great division between peoples, when old hatreds still festered like untreated wounds, and that this infant would either heal these divisions or become their victim, depending on whether the family had the courage to stand against those who would see only an aberration rather than a bridge. Outside their cabin, the wind had risen to a howl that seemed almost sentient in its fury, rattling the windows and sending pine branches scraping across the roof like skeletal fingers. Yet inside, the baby remained unnaturally quiet, its dark eyes open and seemingly aware in a way that no newborn should be, as if it understood every word being spoken about its destiny. Ezekiel looked up from the journal to meet Martha's gaze, seeing his own mixture of fear and wonder reflected there, and he moved to sit beside her on the bed, reaching out tentatively to touch the child's soft cheek, while explaining that his grandfather had spent years trying to understand what Silent Crow meant, researching Cherokee beliefs about spirit debts and generational memory, ultimately concluding that their family had been chosen, not cursed, to play a role in something larger than themselves. The midwife, who had remained silent through these revelations, finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, saying she had delivered hundreds of babies in her 40 years of practice, but had never seen anything like this. Yet something in the child's peaceful demeanor and the way the very air in the room seemed charged with an electric presence made her believe they were witnessing something sacred rather than scandalous. Martha asked the question that hung between them like morning mist, wondering aloud how they would explain this to their neighbors, to the town, to everyone who would see only the surface and judge them for something that existed beyond the realm of ordinary understanding or conventional morality. The morning of the third day brought Reverend Pike's horse plodding up the narrow mountain trail to the Hawthorne cabin, his black coat flapping like crow wings as he dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who had blessed hundreds of mountain babies in his 20 years of ministry. But when Martha opened the door holding the infant, his practiced smile froze, and his step backward was so sudden that he nearly tumbled off the porch. The Reverend's pale blue eyes widened with shock that quickly transformed into something closer to horror as he took in the child's dark skin and features that bore no resemblance to either parent, and though Ezekiel tried to explain about family history and Cherokee prophecies, Pike was already backing away, muttering about signs and portents and unnatural occurrences that good Christian folk should not abide. Within hours, the news had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire in dry grass, carried first by Pike to the general store where Mrs. Henderson held court over the gossip, then to the saloon where men nursed whiskey and suspicions in equal measure, and finally to every cabin and homestead within a day's ride, the story growing more twisted with each telling until some claimed the baby had been born with feathers instead of hair or eyes that glowed red in the darkness. Thomas Brennan, who owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory and whose word carried the weight of wealth and influence, was the first to organize what he called a concerned delegation, but what looked more like a mob, gathering 15 men outside the Hawthorne cabin as the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, their faces hard with the kind of righteous anger that had led to burnings and lynchings throughout the frontier. Ezekiel stood in his doorway with his rifle across his chest, not pointed at anyone but clearly ready, while Martha watched from the window with the baby wrapped in her grandmother's quilt, and Brennan's voice boomed across the yard as he declared that no child could naturally appear so different from its parents without the involvement of something unholy, something that endangered the spiritual welfare of their entire community. The other men murmured agreement, their voices creating a low rumble like distant thunder, and as darkness fell, torches began appearing among the crowd, their flames casting dancing shadows that made every face look demonic, transforming neighbors who had shared harvests and barn raisings into strangers whose fear had curdled into hatred. Someone shouted that the child was cursed. Another claimed it was the devil's work, and a third suggested that Martha had lain with a traveling Negro or Indian. each accusation more vicious than the last, while Brennan stood at the center like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of suspicion and rage. The baby, who had been so unnaturally quiet since birth, chose that moment to cry for the first time. And the sound was unlike any infant's wail anyone had heard, carrying notes that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper than human lungs should reach, causing several men to step back and cross themselves, while others gripped their weapons tighter. After the mob had dispersed with Brennan's warning that they would return for a town meeting to decide the family's fate, Martha collapsed onto their bed with the exhaustion of someone who had been holding back a flood with their bare hands, and in the silver moonlight streaming through their bedroom window she finally revealed the secret she had been carrying since the day she first felt life quicken in her womb. The dreams had started that very night, she told Ezekiel in a voice barely above a whisper. Dreams of a Cherokee woman with eyes like polished river stones, who stood at the foot of their bed, speaking in a language Martha did not understand yet somehow comprehended, showing her visions of children who would heal old wounds and bring together people who had forgotten they were all human beneath their different skins. Martha reached beneath their mattress and withdrew something wrapped in cloth, her hands shaking as she revealed a small wooden carving of a crow in flight, its wings spread wide and every feather detailed with extraordinary skill, explaining that she had found it placed carefully in the center of her garden among the summer squash exactly 3 months into her pregnancy, with no footprints or sign of who had left it there. Ezekiel took the carving with trembling fingers and compared it to a sketch in his grandfather's journal, his breath catching as he realized they were identical down to the smallest detail, including a peculiar symbol carved into the bird's breast that Samuel had noted but never understood, and Martha watched as understanding dawned in his eyes that this was bigger than just his family's debt. She continued her confession, describing how the dreams had intensified as her pregnancy progressed, showing her glimpses of the past where Samuel Hawthorne lay dying in the snow while Silent Crow worked through the night to save him, mixing herbs and chanting prayers that seemed to pull his spirit back from whatever dark place it had been traveling toward. The Cherokee woman in her dreams had spoken directly to her only once, Martha revealed, on the night before she gave birth, telling her not to fear what was coming because the child would be a gift, not a curse, a bridge, not a barrier, and that Martha herself had been chosen as the mother because her heart was strong enough to protect what others would seek to destroy. Tears rolled down Martha's cheeks as she admitted her deepest fear was not what the town would do to them, but that she might fail this child who had been marked before birth for a purpose she could barely comprehend. And Ezekiel pulled her close, feeling the weight of destiny settling over them like a heavy blanket. The baby stirred in its cradle beside their bed, making soft sounds that seemed almost like words in a language neither parent recognized. And Martha revealed one final detail that made Ezekiel's blood run cold with its implications, that in her most recent dream, Silent Crow had warned her that Brennan's family had their own dark history with the Cherokee, one that would drive him to violence if he discovered the true nature of the prophecy their child represented. The sun stood directly overhead when Thomas Brennan arrived with 6 armed men, their horses raising dust clouds that hung in the still mountain air like harbingers of violence, and Ezekiel stepped onto his porch with deliberate calm, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm, while Martha watched from behind the thick glass window, the baby quiet in her arms, as if sensing the danger gathering like storm clouds around their home. Brennan remained mounted, looking down at Ezekiel with the cold authority of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, and his voice carried across the yard with practiced command, as he declared that the Hawthorne family had until sunset to pack their belongings and leave the territory, stating that Cedar Ridge had no place for abominations that violated the natural order God had established between the races. The 6 men spread out in a semicircle, their hands resting on pistol grips and rifle stocks, creating a wall of potential violence that made the bright sunshine feel somehow darker, and Ezekiel noticed how their horses seemed unusually skittish, dancing sideways and tossing their heads as if they sensed something their riders could not. Ezekiel kept his voice steady as he responded that this was his legally purchased land, and he would not be driven from it by fear or prejudice. But Brennan's laugh was harsh as winter wind as he revealed information that changed everything, stating that his grandfather, Josiah Brennan, had been Samuel Hawthorne's partner in the winter of 1821, the very winter when Silent Crow had entered their lives. The story Brennan told was different from what Ezekiel had read in his grandfather's journal, claiming that Josiah and Samuel had been tracking elk when they were separated by a blizzard, and when Josiah finally found his partner 3 days later, Samuel was in the clutches of a Cherokee witch who had done something to him, changed him in ways that made him turn against his own kind, and ultimately led to Josiah's mysterious death just 2 years later. Brennan's face darkened as he continued, explaining that his grandfather had died raving about Cherokee curses and warning that the Hawthorne bloodline had been tainted by heathen magic, a warning the Brennan family had dismissed as fever dreams until news of the strange infant's birth had reached them 3 days ago, proving that old Josiah had been right all along about the corruption that Silent Crow had planted in their community. The tension between the two men crackled like lightning about to strike, and even the insects had gone silent as if nature itself held its breath. While behind the window Martha felt the baby stir in her arms, its dark eyes fixed on Brennan, with an intensity that seemed impossible for a child only 3 days old. Ezekiel realized with growing horror that this was not just about fear of the unknown or racial prejudice, but about a parallel family history of loss and blame that had been fermenting for decades, and that Brennan saw their child not just as an anomaly, but as the culmination of a vendetta that had begun before any of them were born, making this confrontation inevitable as the sunrise that would either see them gone or see blood spilled on the dusty ground between them. The knock at their door came at the stroke of midnight, soft but insistent, and when Ezekiel peered through the window, he saw an elderly Cherokee man standing alone in the moonlight, his silver hair braided with feathers and beads that caught the light like stars, his weathered face bearing the kind of deep lines that came from decades of both laughter and sorrow. The man introduced himself as Joseph Whitefeather, speaking in accented but clear English as he explained that he was Silent Crow's grandson and had travelled 4 days through dangerous territory after receiving a vision that the prophesied child had finally been born, and that he had come to verify what his grandmother had foreseen all those years ago when she saved Samuel Hawthorne's life. Ezekiel hesitated only a moment before inviting the old man inside, and as Joseph crossed the threshold, the very air in the cabin seemed to shift and thicken, becoming charged with an energy that made the hair on Martha's arms stand up and caused the flames in the fireplace to dance in patterns that defied the natural movement of fire. Joseph approached the cradle where the baby lay awake despite the late hour, and as he leaned down to examine the child, his ancient eyes widened with recognition, and something that might have been relief, and he spoke softly in Cherokee before switching back to English to confirm that this was indeed the child of prophecy, the one who carried what he called old medicine in its veins. The baby's dark eyes seemed to catch and hold the firelight in a way that made them appear to glow from within, not with any supernatural radiance, but with an intensity of awareness that belonged in someone decades older, and Joseph explained that this was just the beginning of what the child would manifest as it grew, abilities that would include healing touch and the sight to perceive things hidden from ordinary vision. Martha asked with barely concealed desperation what this meant for their family, for their safety, for their future in a community that already wanted them gone, and Joseph's response was both comforting and terrifying, as he revealed that the child's purpose went beyond anything they could imagine, that it would serve as a bridge between worlds that had been separated by violence and mistrust for generations, but that this bridging would require sacrifices they could not yet comprehend. The old man produced a small leather pouch from his travelling pack and placed it on the table, explaining that it contained herbs and sacred items that would help protect the child until its power fully manifested, warning them that others would come seeking either to destroy or exploit what the baby represented. and that the Brennan family's hatred was rooted in more than just prejudice, but in a fear of what would be revealed about their own dark history. Joseph stayed until nearly dawn, teaching them Cherokee words of protection and showing them signs to watch for as the child grew, explaining that the baby would likely remain quiet and observant for months before displaying abilities that would force them to make choices about whether to hide or stand firm. And as he prepared to leave, he turned to them with eyes that held both sorrow and hope, saying that their child would either unite the divided peoples of this territory or become a casualty of their inability to overcome their fears. 2 weeks after Joseph Whitefeather's visit, Brennan returned with 8 men, their horses snorting steam in the crisp morning air as they surrounded the cabin with rifles drawn, demanding that Ezekiel surrender the child to be examined by the town doctor and minister to determine if it was truly human or something else altogether. Ezekiel emerged onto the porch with Martha behind him holding the infant, trying to reason with the men who had once been his neighbors, when suddenly the baby let out a cry unlike anything it had produced before, a sound that seemed to pierce straight through to some primal part of every living creature within hearing distance. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying as all 9 horses reared simultaneously, their eyes rolling white with terror as they bolted in different directions despite their riders' desperate attempts at control, throwing 3 men to the ground and sending the others racing after their mounts across the mountainside, leaving Brennan standing alone and shaken in the dusty yard. In the days that followed this incident, Ezekiel began noticing other strange occurrences, particularly the way birds of every variety gathered around their property whenever he carried the child outside, not in the aggressive manner of protecting their territory, but almost reverently, perching on fence posts and tree branches in perfect silence, as if bearing witness to something sacred. Ravens, sparrows, hawks, and even a golden eagle once descended to create a living circle around the cabin, and when Martha brought the baby to the window, they would turn their heads in unison to watch, their black eyes reflecting an intelligence that made Ezekiel question everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The most startling discovery came when Martha was preparing vegetables for supper, and the knife slipped, cutting deep into her palm and sending blood flowing across the cutting board. But when the baby's tiny hand accidentally brushed the wound as she reached for a cloth, the bleeding stopped instantly and the flesh knitted together before their eyes, leaving only a faint pink line that disappeared within minutes. Martha and Ezekiel stared at each other in amazement and fear, understanding that their child possessed abilities that would either be seen as miraculous or demonic depending on who witnessed them, and they began to realize that hiding these powers might become impossible as the baby grew and its influence on the world around them became stronger. The autumn forest itself seemed more vibrant near their homestead, with trees holding their leaves longer than those further away, late wildflowers blooming out of season in a circle around their cabin, and even the creek running clearer and singing louder as it passed their property, as if nature itself was responding to the child's presence with its own form of celebration. These manifestations of power changed everything about their situation, transforming them from victims of prejudice to guardians of something genuinely extraordinary. And when word inevitably spread about the horses bolting and the strange gatherings of birds, the town's fear evolved from simple bigotry into something deeper and more complex, a recognition that this child represented forces beyond their understanding or control. Joseph Whitefeather returned 3 weeks later carrying a leather satchel worn smooth by decades of handling, and his arrival coincided with an emergency town meeting called by Brennan to decide the fate of the Hawthorne family, the makeshift courtroom packed with every soul from Cedar Ridge as afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, turning dust motes into floating gold that seemed to dance with anticipation of revelations about to unfold. The old Cherokee man entered the crowded room with quiet dignity despite the hostile stares and muttered curses that followed his passage, and when he approached the front where Brennan stood beside the circuit judge who had arrived that morning, he announced in a clear voice that he had documents that would change everything they thought they knew about the conflict between their families. From his satchel, Joseph produced papers that had been preserved between sheets of pressed bark, including military records, witness testimonies, and a signed confession that had been hidden for decades, and as he laid them on the judge's table, the room grew so quiet that the only sound was the creaking of wooden benches as people leaned forward to see what was being revealed. The first document was a military report from 1819 describing how Josiah Brennan had led an unauthorized raid on a peaceful Cherokee settlement, killing 7 people including 3 children, an attack that had been covered up because Brennan had connections to the territorial governor, but which had been witnessed by a young soldier named Samuel Hawthorne who had tried to stop the massacre. Joseph's voice remained steady as he read from Samuel's own testimony, describing how he had confronted Josiah about the murders and been left for dead in the wilderness as a result, only to be found and saved by Silent Crow, whose own daughter had been among those killed in Brennan's raid, yet who chose to heal rather than seek vengeance. The revelation that Silent Crow had saved the life of a man who had tried to protect her people, rather than being some witch who had corrupted him, sent ripples of shock through the assembled crowd, and Thomas Brennan's face went pale as he realized his family's carefully maintained story of victimization was crumbling before dozens of witnesses. Joseph continued with the most stunning revelation of all, explaining that what had been called a curse was actually a form of protection and prophecy, that Silent Crow had foreseen that one day a child would be born who could heal the wounds between their peoples, and that she had bound the Hawthorne bloodline to this purpose not as punishment, but as an opportunity for redemption that Josiah Brennan's line had forfeited through violence. The judge, an educated man from the state capital who had little patience for frontier vendettas, studied the documents carefully before declaring that not only were they authentic, but that they revealed potential crimes that had never been properly investigated. And he turned to Thomas Brennan with eyes that promised justice long delayed, stating that the real question was not whether the Hawthorne child belonged in the community, but whether the Brennan family had any right to judge anyone given their own blood-soaked history. The visions began the morning after the courthouse revelations, hitting Martha like cold water as she kneaded bread dough in her kitchen, her hands suddenly going still as images flooded her mind of men with torches approaching through the forest. Brennan's face twisted with rage as he struck a match against their barn door while they slept inside the cabin, unaware of the danger gathering around them. She gasped and gripped the table for support as the vision continued, showing her exact details of when and how the attack would come, 3 nights hence when the moon was dark, and when the images finally released her, she found the baby watching her from its cradle with those impossibly aware eyes, as if it had somehow shared what she had seen. Martha told Ezekiel immediately, describing the vision with such precise detail that he could not dismiss it as anxiety or imagination, especially when she mentioned things she could not have known, like the fact that Brennan had been meeting secretly with 5 men from the next valley, rough types who cared nothing for law or justice and would burn a family alive for the right price. The change in Martha was immediate and profound, as she realized these visions were a gift passed to her through her connection to their extraordinary child. And she moved through their home with new purpose, no longer the frightened woman who had cowered behind windows, but a protector preparing for battle with the foreknowledge of exactly what was coming. She instructed Ezekiel to dig a hidden cellar entrance behind the woodpile, where they could escape if needed, to store water barrels at strategic points around the property, and to spread word quietly to their few remaining allies about what was planned, her voice carrying an authority that made him follow her directions without question, marveling at this transformation in his wife. Over the following days, more visions came to her at unexpected moments, showing her not just immediate dangers, but glimpses of possible futures, including one where their child stood as a young adult before a gathering of both Cherokee and white settlers, speaking words that would finally bridge the divide between their peoples, and another darker vision where the child was taken from them and raised by those who would use its gifts for their own ends. The visions also revealed smaller, more immediate things that proved their validity, like where to find a hidden spring during the drought that was coming, which merchant would try to cheat them next market day, and even that Joseph Whitefeather would return with more allies than expected, all of which came to pass exactly as she had seen. Ezekiel found himself relying on Martha's newfound sight as much as his own strength, and their partnership deepened from mere marriage into something more profound as they accepted their role as guardians of a child whose importance extended far beyond their small family, binding them together with purpose that transcended their original simple dreams of frontier life. The night Martha had foreseen finally arrived with clouds obscuring the stars, and when Brennan's men crept toward their property with oil and torches, they found the family gone, the cabin empty, and the sheriff waiting with Joseph Whitefeather and 20 Cherokee warriors who had come to ensure that this time justice would not be denied. The chase had driven them higher into the mountains than any white settler had ventured before, up ancient paths known only to the Cherokee, until the Hawthorne family found themselves trapped on a plateau that Joseph Whitefeather would later reveal was sacred ground, where his people had buried their dead for generations before being forced from these lands. Brennan and 12 men had pursued them through the night after the failed burning, their hatred now mixed with desperation as the judge's investigation threatened to expose decades of hidden crimes. And as they emerged from the tree line with weapons drawn, the morning sun revealed they stood on earth marked by weathered stones arranged in patterns that spoke of ceremonies and sorrows from long before any of them were born. The moment Martha set foot on the burial ground carrying the child, something shifted in the very atmosphere around them, as if the land itself had awakened from a long slumber, and the wind that had been still suddenly rose with such force that several of Brennan's men staggered backward, their horses refusing to step onto the sacred earth no matter how hard they spurred them. The baby began to cry. But this was different from any sound it had made before, a keening wail that seemed to harmonize with the wind itself, and the ancient pine trees surrounding the plateau began to groan and sway despite the wind not being strong enough to move such massive trunks, their branches creating sounds like whispered voices in a language older than memory. Ezekiel stood protectively before his family with his rifle ready, though he sensed that conventional weapons meant little in this place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual world had grown thin, and he watched in amazement as the very ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with a rhythm like a giant heartbeat. Just as Brennan ordered his men forward despite their obvious terror, Joseph Whitefeather emerged from the forest, leading 30 Cherokee warriors and, more surprisingly, 15 townspeople from Cedar Ridge, including the judge himself, Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed the child's effect on the birds, and several families who had been swayed by the documents revealing the truth about the Brennan family's past. The two groups faced each other across the sacred ground, creating a tableau that represented decades of conflict and mistrust, with the Hawthorne family and their extraordinary child standing at the center like a bridge between worlds that had been separated by violence for far too long. Brennan's face contorted with rage as he realized he was outnumbered. But more than that, he seemed to finally understand that he stood on ground where his family's crimes carried weight that no amount of wealth or influence could overcome, where the ghosts of those his grandfather had murdered might finally have their say in the form of this strange child whose very existence challenged everything he had been taught about racial superiority and divine right. The child's crying reached a crescendo that made everyone cover their ears, and then suddenly stopped, leaving a silence so complete that even breathing seemed too loud. And in that moment of absolute stillness, everyone present felt the weight of choice pressing down on them to continue the cycle of hatred or to finally break it. When the child's cry ceased and that impossible silence filled the sacred ground, something extraordinary began to happen, as every person present suddenly gasped and stumbled as if struck by an invisible force, their eyes rolling back as a shared vision flooded through their minds with the intensity of lived memory rather than mere imagination. They saw the land as it had been before any of them were born, when Cherokee families had lived in harmony with the mountain, and then they witnessed Josiah Brennan's raids in terrible detail, the screaming children, the burning homes, the bodies left unburied, and Samuel Hawthorne's desperate attempt to stop the slaughter before being beaten and left for dead in the snow. Thomas Brennan fell to his knees as he experienced his grandfather's crimes not as distant history but as if he himself were wielding the rifle, feeling the sick pleasure Josiah had taken in the killing, and the vision showed him how that violence had poisoned his family line, creating a legacy of hatred that had shaped him from birth into someone who saw other races as less than human. The vision shifted to show Silent Crow finding Samuel, and everyone present felt her terrible grief at losing her daughter, mixed with an incomprehensible mercy as she chose to save the man who had tried to protect her people, and they understood that her prophecy was not revenge but an offering of redemption, a chance for both bloodlines to break free from the cycle of violence. Above them, the sky began to shimmer with lights that had no natural explanation. Ribbons of colour, like the northern lights but impossibly far south, dancing in patterns that seemed to mirror the arrangement of the ancient stones around them. And several people later swore they saw faces in those lights, the ghosts of the murdered Cherokee, looking down with expressions of patient waiting. Brennan's weapon fell from nerveless fingers as he experienced the full weight of his inherited guilt, and tears streamed down his weathered face as he looked at the child in Martha's arms and finally understood that this infant was not an abomination but a gift, a chance for absolution that his family had never deserved but was being offered anyway through an act of grace that defied human comprehension. The other townspeople experienced their own reckonings as the vision showed them how their comfortable lives had been built on stolen land and how their silence in the face of injustice had made them complicit in crimes they had pretended not to see. And one by one, weapons were lowered, as the weight of truth became too heavy to bear, while maintaining the fiction of righteous anger. Mrs. Henderson was the first to speak when the vision finally released them, her voice breaking as she walked forward to stand beside the Hawthorne family, declaring that she had been a fool to fear what she did not understand, and her movement seemed to break a dam as others followed, choosing reconciliation over continued conflict. The Cherokee warriors watched in amazement as their ancient burial ground accomplished what decades of arguments and laws had failed to achieve, forcing the white settlers to truly see and feel the cost of their expansion. And Joseph Whitefeather spoke words of healing in both Cherokee and English, offering a path forward that honored the dead while protecting the living, with the extraordinary child as the symbol of what could be possible when people chose courage over fear, understanding over ignorance, and love over the inherited hatred that had poisoned the land for far too long. The spring morning 6 months later found Ezekiel sitting at his desk by the window, carefully recording in a new leather journal the remarkable changes that had transformed Cedar Ridge from a town divided by hatred into something that would have seemed impossible just half a year ago. His careful script documenting how Samuel Silent Crow Hawthorne, as they had named the child, had become not a source of conflict, but a living symbol of reconciliation between peoples who had forgotten they shared the same humanity. The child could crawl now with surprising speed and purpose, and wherever he went, a sense of peace seemed to follow, calming arguments between neighbors, soothing sick animals, and most remarkably, serving as the reason for weekly gatherings where Cherokee elders sat with white settlers to share knowledge about farming, medicine, and the history of the land they now acknowledged belonging to all of them. Thomas Brennan had undergone the most dramatic transformation, selling half his ranch to provide reparations to Cherokee families and working alongside Joseph Whitefeather to establish a school where children of both communities could learn together, his former rage replaced by a quiet determination to undo the damage his family had caused across generations. Trade had opened between the settlement and the Cherokee village deeper in the mountains, with goods and knowledge flowing both ways, and Martha's visions had helped both communities prepare for harsh weather and locate new resources, her gift now seen as a blessing rather than something to fear. while young Samuel seemed to understand every word spoken to him in both English and Cherokee, despite being far too young for such comprehension. The town meetings now included Cherokee representatives, and decisions about land use and resources were made collectively, a system that had already prevented two potential conflicts and led to the discovery of a new silver vein that both communities would mine together, sharing the profits according to need rather than greed. Ezekiel wrote about how the child's presence had awakened something in the land itself, with crops growing fuller, water running clearer, and even the wildlife seeming less fearful of human presence, as if nature recognized that the people had finally begun to heal the wounds they had inflicted on each other and the earth. As he set down his pen and walked outside where Martha sat with Samuel in the garden they had expanded to include Cherokee healing plants alongside their vegetables, he watched his son crawl toward an old apple tree that had stood barren for 3 years, its trunk scarred by lightning and its branches brittle with death. The moment Samuel placed his tiny hand on the rough bark, something miraculous happened as the tree shuddered from roots to crown, its dead wood suddenly flushing with life as green shoots burst from every branch, leaves unfurling with impossible speed, until within moments, the entire tree was covered in bright blossoms that filled the air with the sweet promise of fruit to come. Martha and Ezekiel exchanged glances of wonder but no longer surprise, for they had come to accept that their son existed at the intersection of the natural and supernatural, and as neighbors, both Cherokee and white, gathered to witness this latest miracle, no one spoke of curses or abominations, but instead of the blessing that had come to their community through pain and reconciliation, transforming them all into something better than they had been before. And Ezekiel picked up his journal again to record this moment for future generations, knowing that the story of Samuel Silent Crow Hawthorne would be told long after all of them were gone, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal when people chose love over fear and found the courage to face the truth of their shared history.